The blue marble turns a sickly, translucent white before the first scream can even leave a human throat. Across the Antarctic plateau, 5 million cubic kilometers of ice do not melt, they undergo a violent, instantaneous phase transition. Solid crystalline structures, some 3 kilometers thick and hundreds of thousands of years old, vanish into a liquid state in a single microsecond. The sudden loss of structural integrity causes the entire continent of Antarctica to collapse downward, as the weight of the ice no longer exists to hold the continental shelf in place. At the same time, the volume of the ocean increases by nearly 70 meters in a heartbeat. A wall of water, moving at the speed of sound, erupts from the poles. It is not a wave, it is a displacement of the entire planetary fluid envelope. The pressure differential is so immense that the air itself is pushed outward, creating a global atmospheric shockwave that shatters every pane of glass on the planet simultaneously. In the deep ocean trenches, the sudden increase in hydrostatic pressure causes the seafloor to groan and buckle. Coastal cities like New York, London, Tokyo, and Mumbai do not have time to flood. They are simply erased. The sheer kinetic energy of 70 meters of vertical water height, instantly moving horizontally, turns skyscrapers into fine particulate dust. The water does not look like the ocean, it is a churning, brown-gray sludge of pulverized concrete, steel, and organic matter. This is the end. But to understand why, we must rewind to the beginning. In the steady state of the 21st century, Earth exists in a delicate, frozen equilibrium. The cryosphere, comprising the vast ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, the mountain glaciers, and the perennial permafrost, acts as the world's primary thermal regulator. These frozen reservoirs hold approximately 69% of the planet's fresh water. To comprehend the scale of what is about to break, one must look at the physics of the Antarctic ice sheet. It is a monolithic structure covering 14 million square kilometers. Its weight is so profound that it literally deforms the Earth's crust, pushing the bedrock deep into the mantle. This is known as isostatic depression. The ice acts as a massive mirror, a phenomenon called the albedo effect. More than 80% of the solar radiation hitting these white expanses is reflected back into deep space, preventing the atmosphere from absorbing lethal amounts of thermal energy. Furthermore, the ice regulates the global thermohaline circulation, the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. As sea ice forms in the North Atlantic, it leaves behind salt, creating cold, dense, saline water that sinks to the bottom of the ocean. This downward plunge drives the currents that carry warm water from the equator to the poles, ensuring that Europe remains temperate rather than a frozen wasteland. We live in a world defined by the slow, rhythmic pulse of freezing and thawing. Gravity holds the ice in place, and the latent heat of fusion ensures that melting is a slow, energy-intensive process. It takes 334 joules of energy to melt just 1 gram of ice. But in our scenario, the laws of thermodynamics are suspended. The energy barrier vanishes. The transition is absolute and immediate. The first millisecond of the instant melt begins with the total collapse of the Antarctic and Greenlandic ice domes. Under normal gravity, ice flows like a very thick liquid over centuries. But when that ice becomes liquid water in an instant, it loses all internal friction. The 3-kilometer-high walls of water at the South Pole fall toward the ocean with a gravitational potential energy that defies calculation. As this mass hits the Southern Ocean, the splash alone sends plumes of water into the stratosphere. The sudden addition of 5 million cubic kilometers of liquid to the world's oceans creates a global pressure wave. Because water is nearly incompressible, this force is transmitted through the entire oceanic body at nearly 1,500 meters per second. In the North Atlantic, the Greenland ice sheet, which contains enough water to raise sea levels by 7 meters, dissolves. The North American and European coastlines are the first to feel the atmospheric displacement. The air, shoved aside by the rising tide, creates a supersonic wind. In London, the Thames barrier is not overwhelmed, it is vaporized. The water does not flow up the river, it simply levels the city, moving at 800 kilometers per hour. The thermal energy released by the friction of this movement begins to boil the leading edge of the flood. A thick, opaque mist of superheated steam blankets the coastlines, hiding the destruction from any eyes that might still be watching. The physics of the Earth's rotation now begin to play a terrifying role. The Earth is an oblate spheroid, bulging at the equator due to centrifugal force. As the ice at the poles melts and the water redistributes itself, the planet's moment of inertia changes. Just as a figure skater slows down by extending their arms, the Earth's rotation slows. The day lengthens by several milliseconds instantly, but the tectonic impact is far more severe. The crust, suddenly relieved of the trillions of tons of ice at the poles, begins to spring upward in a process called post-glacial rebound, but accelerated to a violent degree. This triggers global megathrust earthquakes. Every fault line on the planet, from the San Andreas to the Himalayan thrust, ruptures simultaneously. The sound is a low-frequency roar that vibrates the very marrow of human bones, a tectonic scream that lasts for hours. As the oceans settle at their new height of 70 meters above the previous norm, the map of the world is unrecognizable. Florida is gone. The entire eastern seaboard of the United States has retreated to the Appalachian Mountains. In South America, the Amazon basin has become a vast inland sea, its rainforests drowned under tens of meters of saltwater. The salt levels in the ocean have plummeted. The sudden injection of fresh water has killed the thermohaline circulation. The great conveyor belt stops dead. This causes the remaining heat in the atmosphere to become trapped at the equator, while the high latitudes begin a terrifyingly rapid cooling process. The chemistry of the atmosphere is also in a state of violent flux. Trapped within the permafrost of Siberia and northern Canada were hundreds of billions of tons of methane and carbon dioxide. With the permafrost gone, these gases erupt into the sky in a massive, invisible burp. Methane is 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. The sky takes on a hazy, yellowish tint as the chemical composition shifts. The smell of sulfur and ancient, rotting organic matter fills the air, a scent of the deep past rising to claim the present. Most turn away from the void. But here at Velastrix, we decode the math behind the chaos. Join the archive by subscribing now. The secondary effects now begin to ripple through the broken biosphere. The sudden rise in sea level has submerged every coastal nuclear power plant, every chemical refinery, and every sewage treatment facility on Earth. The oceans are no longer just salt water, they are a toxic soup of heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and pathogens that have been dormant for millions of years in the ice. The marine ecosystem collapses. Coral reefs, the nurseries of the ocean, are now 70 meters too deep to receive sunlight. They fade away within days, turning into white, skeletal cetaceans. The phytoplankton, which produce 50% of the world's oxygen, are choked by the sediment and the sudden change in salinity. Oxygen levels begin a slow, agonizing decline. On land, the loss of the glaciers means the end of the world's water towers. The Ganges, the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Indus rivers, which provide water for billions of people, now have no source. The mountains are bare rock. After the initial floods recede from the high ground, a permanent, searing drought sets in. The interior of the continents becomes a dust bowl. Without the albedo effect from the poles, the planet absorbs more heat than ever before. Even as the poles experience erratic weather, the average global temperature begins to climb by 10, 15, then 20 degrees Celsius. The remaining forests ignite in global wildfires that last for months, casting a shroud of black soot into the upper atmosphere. The tectonic instability continues. With the water weight redistributed, the pressure on the oceanic plates increases while the pressure on the continental plates decreases. This imbalance leads to a surge in volcanic activity. Along the Ring of Fire, volcanoes that have been dormant for millennia begin to erupt, spewing ash that mixes with the soot of the burning forests. The sky turns from yellow to a deep, bruised purple. Lightning, fueled by the intense heat and particulate matter in the air, strikes the Earth thousands of times a second in a permanent global electrical storm. The silence that follows the first month is the most terrifying part. The mechanical hum of civilization, the engines, the grids, the chatter of billions, is gone. The few survivors on the high plateaus of Tibet, the Andes, and the Rockies look down upon a world of water and fire. The coastlines are gone, the breadbaskets are drowned or parched, and the air itself feels heavy and wrong. The geography of the human soul is as shattered as the geography of the Earth. We are no longer a spacefaring, digital species, we are a remnant, clinging to the high ground of a planet that has discarded its frozen armor and turned into a hothouse. The long-term recovery of the planet will take millions of years. Eventually, the carbon cycle will stabilize, and the volcanic ash will settle. The Earth will find a new equilibrium, perhaps as a water world with a thick, humid atmosphere and shallow, tropical seas covering the ruins of our greatest cities. New life forms will evolve to breathe the different air and swim in the toxic, warm oceans. The era of ice, the Holocene, and the Anthropocene will be nothing more than a thin layer of strange sediment in the geological record, a layer of plastic, pulverized concrete, and a sudden spike in carbon. The instant melting of the ice is more than a physical catastrophe, it is a total reset of the biological clock. It reminds us that our stability is an illusion, a temporary gift from the cold. Our cities, our culture, and our very breath are dependent on the fact that the water at the ends of the earth remains solid. When that solid turns to liquid, the vessel of our civilization shatters beyond repair, leaving behind a world that is unrecognizable, beautiful in its own horrific way, but no longer ours. To explore the impossible and visualize the unknown, subscribe to Velastrix.